Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you're at. Welcome to the Turfgrass Epistemology podcast. I'm Travis Shaddix. Thank you for joining me. I have today some work to do outside that I do not want to do. I had to dig a trench. Whoever built my house apparently built the lawn on a 6-inch bed of gravel. So every time I go in and try to do something, I got to dig through 6 inches of gravel. But I got to put some drainage in. So I'm doing everything I can to procrastinate and to not go out and do it. So that's what I got going on today. Beautiful day in Lexington. Can't imagine a nicer place to live than Lexington. It's so peaceful outside, sunny and cool, and lovely day. Cool season grass is going gangbusters right now in Lexington. Probably will so for the next several weeks. Today we're going to continue with the cool season fall fertility topic. I have the last 1967 paper from Dr. Powell. It's very short. It probably holds the record for the shortest agronomy journal record, or your shortest agronomy journal paper. It's only 2 pages, 1 graph. Very, very short. And what I'll do afterwards, because it's only going to take 5 or 10 minutes, but what I'll do afterwards is I'll follow that up today with another paper from, it's sort of why Dr. Powell did this work. I can include that paper after this as a quick, add-on to make the time up. Or if you want to come on now on the video, let me know in chat and I'll send you a link if you want to join me and we can discuss it, I can ask you questions, or you can ask me questions, or whatever. We can, in other words, instead of doing the paper after this paper, you can come on right now if you'd like, and we can have a conversation. If you don't want to, that's cool. I'll go over another paper, not a problem. But if you want to send a note in chat and just say, hey, I'll come on, then send an email to my email at travisshadix@gmail.com. And then I'll reply to your email with the link and stuff, and you can come on. It just takes me a couple minutes. I think I should be able to get you in here if you want to do that. And if you don't, totally cool. Question from Looney. He asks in chat, I've been looking into getting access to these papers and wondering which membership I should join. Would getting the CSA membership be enough, or should I also get the ASA or CSSSA membership too? So they're commonly called in the science world the tri-societies. Getting access to one will give you access to all of them. After you join, let's say the ASA, they'll give you options as to which journals you want access to. So I don't know what the membership fee is now. I haven't looked at it. It's probably a couple $100. I don't really remember. But afterwards, you can get access to the actual journal by selecting which journal you want. I don't recall exactly. The last time I checked, I think they changed it to where, well, you'll have to go in and look. I think you can just gain access to the electronic versions of it. In the old days, you had to select them, and then they would send you the actual hard copy of the journal back in the 90s and before. But now it's all electronic for the most part. So after you join the ASA, which is what I would suggest you do, you'll have the options at that point to go and select which journals. I can't remember if you have to select, I don't know if you have to select 1 or 2 and you pay per journal, or if now they have like a umbrella membership for journal access. I can't remember. Okay. 134 for each, or 182 for 2 and 2. Okay, there you go. So if that's the case, Lenny, then they've changed it periodically throughout the years. So I'm not sure exactly what they have nowadays, but for some reason I end up, the only journals you really need to get access to, and I think if I recall, I don't remember my membership now, but I normally get crop science is automatic. I get that one. There's not a question, because the majority of turfgrass papers are going to go into crop science. But I'm also a soil scientist, so I end up getting memberships to agronomy journal after that. And then you can get, Soil Science Side of America Journal or JEQ, which is the Journal of Environmental Quality, you won't really find, it just depends on what your interests are. JEQ is not going to have like tissue test data or something like that. They're going to be more like leaching data and leaching results and volatilization and things like that. So, but crop's going to have like the turf stuff, and agronomy journal is going to have soil and turf, and of course soil science is going to have mainly soils. A Soil Science Side of America would probably be my last journal if you're looking just for turf information, because it's going to be mainly soil related. I have a paper or two in there, but it's soil stuff. I mean, it is turf too, but it's more soil. So that's the order I would do it: crop science, and then agronomy journal, and then maybe JEQ after that if you want to do that. Agriculture Environmental Letters is also in there as well, but it's a free. I think it's open. I believe it's open access if I recall. I don't recall exactly. It's been a while since I've looked through there. And then, of course, Crop Forage and Turfgrass Management is another sort of applied journal that I don't believe you have to pay for. You can get that for free as well. I think anybody can get that for free. I don't think you have to be a member. So, good questions. I'm glad you're interested in joining. Access to those journal articles, and you can. I mean, if you're so inclined, you could join, pay for the membership, pay for the journal, and then just for that next year, just go through and save all the PDFs, and collect all the journal articles you wanted to. And then the only thing that you would lose after that year's membership would be any new publications, right? If you really were so inclined to really go into the literature, there's hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of turfgrass articles in the crop science. So you can really spend a lot of time going through there. But you spend 1 year on it, you get a membership, you can make the most of it by really pulling out and saving all those PDFs. I mean, I can show you my file that I have PDFs in. I don't know how many hundreds of articles I have in there from over the years. I've just saved them. In the old days, before electronics, I would just have to photocopy them from the library or from the journal that I would receive. I would photocopy them. I keep them in a file cabinet, and I keep them in alphabetical order by author, because you have to have the hard copy paper. But nowadays it's so much easier. But thanks for your interest in that. So Randy, you have a question. Hello, I'm interested in relationships for root mass growth and carbohydrate reserves, and how we can manage turf for more reserves. Can't find any good papers. Well, I guess my first question is, why would you want to manage your turfgrass to have greater reserves of carbohydrates? So today's paper is about roots, so we'll go into that a little bit. Yesterday's paper, Randy, I'm not sure if you were here yesterday, but yesterday there was quite a bit of discussion on roots and carbohydrates, and how the application date and rate of nitrogen influence carbohydrate reserves. So if you weren't here yesterday, go back and watch yesterday's video. There's a little bit of a discussion on that. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion on that today as well. Not much, but a little bit. But in the short and skinny of it is that carbohydrate reserves are used or stored in stems and roots more than in leaves usually as you go into the fall. And then there's greater carbohydrates in the leaves than in the stems as the plant begins to photosynthesize in the spring and summer. Depends on which plant's cool season or warm season. But at the end of the day, the carbohydrates in the roots are used to metabolize nitrogen. And it doesn't need to use those carbohydrate reserves. If there is a source of carbohydrates in the leaves, it won't really pull from those. And so that's sort of the gist of it, basically. So when photosynthesis occurs, or when nitrogen metabolization is required and there's no photosynthase or carbohydrates in the leaves, then it'll pull it from the plant. Think of it, it's not much dissimilar than your body, honestly. I used an analogy yesterday about this gentleman, and I should have looked up his name, who lives off in the Brooks Range in Alaska, who does nothing but eat meat. Well, he can't survive unless he has carbohydrates, so he has to eat the fat from the meat in order to be able to metabolize the protein in the meat. That's critical for him, is the fat. It's the same thing with us. in order to metabolize nitrogen from the proteins we eat, we have to have the carbohydrates. And when we have excess carbohydrates, we end up building fat. That's how we get overweight. So it's very similar in plants. The concept is very similar. So anyway, thanks for joining me. Let's get started. Again, if you want to join me on video, first just say hey, say you want to in the chat. Send me a link or send me an email to my email, travisshaddox@gmail.com. This paper is going to take like 5 or 10 minutes to get through and we'll be done. If you don't want to join me, cool. I'll go into another article. Okay, here we go. So today's paper, effect of nitrogen on winter root growth of bentgrass. Winter root growth of bentgrass. Said that wrong. By Powell, Blazer, and Schmidt. They're the same authors that did the paper yesterday in 1967. So the previous paper was published in the summer. This paper was published in the fall or winter of 67. Very short. Let's just get into it and we'll get through it. All right. Deep and extensive root systems aid in providing sufficient water, nutrients, and some energy from carbohydrate reserves. Let me see if I can get my pen out here. Okay. It is generally thought that moderate N additions during growing seasons decrease root growth rate. Okay. This was in 67. Remember, and the paper I'm going to show after this, if no one wants to come on, then is going to be from before this period. It really it really shows why Powell did this work from a previous paper. However, little has been done on root growth rate during winter when metabolic activity is considered low. Recent work, this is his own work, recent work has shown that winter nitrogen additions in Virginia latitudes increase metabolic activity of cool season turf, as evidenced by improved winter color. Remember, yesterday's paper showed there was an improvement of winter color as a result of the nitrogen applications monthly or bi-monthly, but we didn't get a lot of growth. And he concluded that the green color, the increased greening in the fall, that was not accompanied by increased growth was a result of the freezing temperatures. In other words, the freezing temperature had a greater effect on the growth rate than it did on photosynthesis. There was still some photosynthesis occurring as a result, evidenced by the greening of the tissue. But there wasn't a lot of growth because it was so cold. Okay. So he says recent work, increased metabolic activity, photosynthesis, and increased photosynthetic rate and slower depletion of carbohydrate reserves during winter. Okay. So, Randy, your question was metabolic or was photosynthesis carbohydrates and roots. The paper yesterday talked about nitrogen and rates and timings and the slower depletion of carbohydrate reserves during winter as a result of the nitrogen, the low nitrogen. The nitrogen effect upon winter growth was questioned since little or no top growth could be measured between December and March. So in his paper yesterday, they had a section cut out of the graph because there was no growth. In other words, you're mowing, you're taking clippings, and all of a sudden the grass goes dormant. Well, there's nothing to collect. When you're a scientist, there's nothing out there to collect. So they said there was no growth. But apparently someone in the 60s following his paper said, hey, wait a second. They questioned it. And he says right here, it was the end effect on winter growth was questioned because there was no growth. So he went out and did another study, which is the one we're talking about right now, to show what happened with the roots. Okay, and you'll see, as it was yesterday, I'm whiting out different sections of this to kind of keep me focused and kind of keep the paper down, the podcast down to about an hour or less. But what's whited out is really not pertinent to the author's objectives and what they concluded. So if you want all the information that's been in the paper, then you'll have to download the paper. Some of these are open access, some of these aren't. But okay, so here's the object. Data are presented here on growth rate of bentgrass roots under putting green conditions as affected by N applications during the fall and winter. So if you want to know what happens on bentgrass, cool season grass, during the fall and winter following N application, you want to know what happens to the roots, here it is. This is what he found. So real quick, what he did, so it says this topsoil and sand were mixed with a mixer and placed in aluminum cans. So basically what he did was he went out and put it, he mixed up these aluminum cans and he put the aluminum cans in a putting green basically, and he maintained it. And then he did that so he could remove that section that he planted the grass in. He could remove that section as in the can, and then have an easier ability to measure the effect of root growth subsequently after that. You can also take those cans. In that case, we wouldn't do that today, but you can take that and place those in temperature chambers and growth chambers and things like that more easily than not doing that. So he had them in cans, and he used those cans as samples, basically. 12 days after planting, on October 12, 1966, the experiment was initiated in 100 milliliters of nitrogen solution at designated rates from ammonium nitrate. So he used ammonium nitrate, and he applied it in a solution. And I'm going to show you the rates that he used and the timings that he used. But that's the nitrogen source that he used. Root growth rate was highest during fall and okay. So before we get to the results and discussion, let me show you the treatments that he used. If I can get it on the screen here without screwing everything up. So these are the treatments that he used. Forget about the graphs right now. Just look at the table. If you're just listening, I'll explain it to you. The treatments and the sampling date. So what he did was he had a non-treated control in here, so he didn't do anything to it. And then he had 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet applied in October. And then he had 1 pound applied in October and December, or 1 pound applied in October, December to February. So he's spacing out the months. Or 1 pound applied October, December, February, April, or 2 pounds applied October, December, February, April. So he's basically doing 1 pound a month. He's doing 1 pound or 1 pound in 2 months, or 1 pound over 3 months, or 1 pound every month for 4 months, or 2 pounds. So he's increasing the rates. And he's applying it either once a month, or he's applying it once a month, but he's either applying it 1 month and then he's doing it, every other month or whatever, or every single month or whatever. Okay. So that was the treatments. He used ammonium nitrate at 1 pound per application per month, and then he just basically did it every month, or once 1 month. You saw it. You saw the treatment. I'm stumbling over my words here. Okay. So that's basically it. That's the treatments, and then we're going to go into the results. Let's see here. Looney has a question. Are soil or air temperature recorded when these applications are made? Fall and winter temperatures are up here are much colder, and I do wonder when to stop applying nitrogen based on temps, not a date. So you are right about applying nitrogen based on temps, not a date. That is probably a more accurate way to do it. In these papers, they do record the temperatures. They're behind these little whiteouts. This particular paper, I don't recall. I do know that... let me see here. Let me switch it back to me. Let me see exactly if they did this or not on this paper. And I'll just read it to you. Usually they do record the temperatures. I don't see it in here. So this one, they might not have recorded the temperature of those dates. I don't see it in here, Looney. I may be missing it, but I don't see it on the PDF. I believe yesterday's paper had the temperatures on there. In fact, I know it did, because he did photosynthesis on 2 different days. One was on a warm day and one was on a cold day. That was from yesterday's paper. So yesterday has the temperature in there. I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but they do record the temperatures. So I'm going to read through here, because you can see this is the end of the paper. This is it. There's 2 more paragraphs. I'm going to go back and talk about the graph here in just 1 second. The amount of nitrogen per application made little difference, as shown by the similarities in root weights of treatments 5 and 6. So remember, treatment 6 was applying 2 pounds a month. Treatment 5 was applying 1 pound a month. And there was little differences between those. However, monthly additions of nitrogen from December to spring retarded root growth rate. I'm going to show that Bentgrass, which received no fertilization, gave good fall growth, but roots grew very slowly in the spring. With the first in application in October, 1 or 2 additional bi-monthly applications gave best total root growth. Such medium rates of nitrogen may be very desirable. If nitrogen rates are too high, carbohydrates are used for in metabolism. So I think it was Randy who said something about that, was interested in the roots. When your nitrogen rates go too high and the supply of nitrogen is inflated to such a degree, the plant is going to take up what it can. And if it exceeds the ability, of the plant to metabolize the nitrogen from the carbohydrates in the leaves, it'll start pulling carbohydrates out of the stems and roots. Okay. And that's what he's saying here. If N rates are too high, carbohydrates are used for nitrogen metabolism. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just it can't assimilate, it can't metabolize the nitrogen without those carbohydrates. If N rates are too low, the plant becomes very brown. Photosynthesis is greatly reduced, and carbohydrates may not be available for root growth. So basically, he's saying it's like a Goldilocks zone. Too low, you're going to have issues. Too high, you're going to start stripping carbohydrates out of the plant. That probably won't, result in some desirable outcome. So somewhere in the middle is probably the desirable rate for this particular study. From these results, it is concluded that bi-monthly nitrogen applications during fall and winter in Virginia latitudes will not only improve winter color and quality of hardy turf grasses, but will also improve root growth. I'm going to hold off on that when it says improve root growth by every other month applying nitrogen. I'm going to show you in a second why that is true, but we want to be aware of other things. So just a second. Turf plants have a larger energy supply and a greater ability to remove water and nutrients from the soil during later stress periods if they have greater roots. Also, the greater root growth during early spring improves the competitive ability of cool season turf. So he's just postulating what the benefits might be. So when applying nitrogen during fall and winter, low N rate should be used in the spring. This decreases the problem in spring of excessive top growth and poor root growth, which results from high rates of nitrogen fertilizer. So let me go back and look at the graphs. Okay, so if I can zoom in here, which is not letting me zoom in now. There we go. Okay, so we're going to look at these graphs. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here, if it lets me. Okay, so these are the graphs. If you're listening and not watching, I'll explain what's going on. So his statement at the end was nitrogen applications will improve root growth. In the fall and winter applications, late fall and nitrogen applications every other month will improve root growth, which is true. Okay, but we want to be aware of what's occurring relative to not applying the nitrogen throughout that time from the first application and the last rating. And that is this. So this T1, remember, is no nitrogen, okay? This T6 is the 2 pounds per month, which is this right here, T1, T6, okay? So we're applying here 8 pounds of nitrogen with this T6, and we're applying no nitrogen with the T1. And you can see what will happen with these roots on bentgrass in Virginia. You have to qualify all this stuff with the roots, weight in grams. So you see this line right here. This is October all the way through into the early spring, February and March. The not applying any nitrogen resulted in more root growth than applying 8 pounds of nitrogen. And the same thing if you look over here in these graphs, applying 4 pounds of nitrogen is very similar to applying 8 pounds over here. This line is very similar to this line. Okay, these are the same. These are the same data points. They just separated them out in different graphs. I don't know why they did that back then, but okay. So early on in the fall and the winter, and even into the very early spring, nitrogen is not going to enhance root growth. It's probably going to reduce root growth. At least in this paper, that's what he's showing. However, after like mid-spring, in this particular, we're in Virginia, don't forget. So mid-spring, say April-ish, around April, this line right here, what I'm making here, that's when the roots become equivalent, and you'll see the same thing over here, roughly in April. That's when these lower rates of nitrogen, the 2 pound and the 3 pound rates of nitrogen, which are this line right here and this line right here, they're going up substantially in the number of roots, or the mass of roots, into the mass of roots. So early on, the roots are being depleted. The mass of roots is being reduced as a result of nitrogen applications. But in the spring, that nitrogen is there. The plant starts growing, and the root mass begins to grow as well, as compared to not applying any nitrogen. Okay, so I guess the take-home message, and you can see that here the T3 was 2 pounds of nitrogen. You can see that the greatest increase was from applying 1 pound in October and 1 pound in December in Virginia. You saw a largest increase in root growth in the spring. It followed by 1 pound in October, 1 in December, and then one in February. It's 3 pounds. So if you're interested in roots, which, can be an important part of your program, if you don't apply anything, you're probably going to have greater roots in the spring, or in the fall and winter. Applying a little nitrogen in October, a little nitrogen in December, you'll probably deplete some of those roots in the winter, but you'll come out in the spring with more roots as the turf begins to grow. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? I think that should be basically the take-home message for this paper. Is the title of the paper is, if I can get it back out here, the effect of nitrogen on winter root growth of bentgrass. And the effect is reduction in root mass early on in the fall and winter, and an increase in root mass in the spring compared to not applying any nitrogen. So those are the two Powell papers that are, well, the first paper yesterday was the one everybody refers to. And this is a follow-up paper about the influence on roots. Okay? Short and sweet. Now, why did Powell even do this work? As he mentioned at the beginning of both of his papers, he said, the thought process or the belief is that you're going to have problems, or fall nitrogen applications are going to result in death or winter kill or disease or whatever the case is. And there was some evidence to support that. It wasn't just some notion that existed in the industry back then. There was some literature that showed there might be something going on there. And so the next paper that I'm going to just follow up with, this paper, is about that. Real quick, let me look and see if there's any. Okay, so before I get to that paper, let me just go through the chat real quick. I was asking, Randy says, I was asking about turf surface recovery for soccer fields in temperature outside normal for, let's say, C3 grasses. If we can build more, I guess that's total non-structural carbohydrates, then we can push more in when there is not enough net photosynthesis for top growth and deplete them. Whoops, hang on. Something's in the way here. And deplete them. Then when there are no games and temps are optimal to rebuild them. Well, I mean, yeah, possibly. I managed some sports fields down in Miami for a year or so. And they had the games at the worst possible time. Whenever I was managing Bermuda grass in Miami, but even in the winter, Bermuda grass slows way down. Well, I wanted to do all of my cultural practices at the optimum time of year, but the optimum time of the year was the exact same time they're playing all the time. So I couldn't ever get in and do proper core aeration and even fertility and pest. It was difficult because I'm trying to work around games. There was 8 or 10 soccer fields down there. And every time it's like, okay, now's the time to do it. You had to set aside a week or two, and the coaches would raise Cain over it. It was just difficult to get everything lined up to the ideal agronomic schedule because of the need to use those fields. So I think I understand what you're saying. When there are no games and temps are optimal to rebuild them, you're probably you're thinking probably on the right lines, Randy. I would just say that I don't know your case. I don't know how many games you had. Okay. In Miami, I would have on one soccer field, I would have 1, 2, 3, 7 soccer fields painted on one soccer field. So there'd be one full field and then one on each half, and then sometimes 2 on each of those halves. And it was just nonstop. The traffic was insane. You couldn't keep enough grass on there. It was the worst traffic. I can't even imagine having worse, unless you're in the NFL or on a horse track or something. It was crazy. And there were games literally there might not have, I think there was games 6 days a week. There might have been one day when there weren't games on those fields. It was absolutely crazy. So I don't know your situation when there are no games and then temps are optimal to rebuild them. So if you have enough time when there are no games and you can get out there and do some work on them, get them get them, resupplied and so forth, then you might have something. It just kind of depends on how many games you're dealing with. If it's insane, then I think you might be, it might be challenging to do what you're thinking of doing, because if there's just never there's just nonstop games all the time. But if you have a break, that's something to consider, I suppose, is what you're saying. I would venture to say, Randy, and not knowing your situation, you might be overthinking it a little bit. I mean, the plant's going to, absorb that nitrogen if it's out there, but and keep growing. It just depends. If you need the top growth to keep up with the damage, then you got to apply nitrogen. It doesn't matter what's going on with the carbohydrates. You've got to get the nitrogen in there. You got to get the plant growing as fast as it can grow to keep up with the damage from the traffic. But if you're thinking about how am I going to balance that most efficiently to build it up and have reserves later, it's possible. But it just depends on traffic. If you have so much damage and it just destroys the turf, like what's happening with me in Miami, it doesn't matter how efficient you're trying to get with the carbohydrates and the nitrogen applications and trying to maximize efficiency. It's just going to be destroyed in the first 2 weeks of the gameplay anyway. I want to say the only time I was even off down there was the 4-day weekend of Thanksgiving. And there might have been like a 2-day break during Christmas. I can't remember now. It's been on so many years. But there was basically 2 weeks of break during the entire year. That's essentially it. So there was nothing I could do. If you're in that situation, it might be a little bit too technical to try to get carbohydrates. If you're in a situation different though, and you have some break times where you can actually, schedule certain things, then you might be able to use that strategy to build up carbohydrates when there's no games, and it might be able to better survive the traffic as a result of its reserved carbohydrates, potentially. Okay. Again, that's just completely dependent upon where you're at and the amount of traffic and time of year and all that stuff. Okay. Let's get to the next PDF, the next article. This is actually a really long one, but I've whited out a whole bunch of it because all I want to get to is the part that was used by scientists back then to validate the need to do more research. Let's look at it. Okay, the name of this article is Effect of Heavy and Late Applications of Nitrogenous Fertilizers on the Cold Resistance of Kentucky Bluegrass. Now, you might look at this article title and go, well, that's a pretty good article title, right? I mean, seems pretty relevant to today. Heavy and Late Applications of Nitrogen Fertilizer on Cold Resistance. That sounds pretty relevant. It's an interesting title, and you might want to read it. It's a new work, right? This was published in 1939. All right. So even in 1939, before World War II, okay, this was still coming out of the Great Depression, and they were doing this work in the United States about heavy and late applications of nitrogenous fertilizers. So I'm going to get through this real quick. It's really not that long. I will say this, is that they don't have a lot of the same information as that we have today. So it's not easy to get through this article with much confidence in the results because they don't have the same statistical separation. They don't even have the same information to be able to repeat the study in many cases. This was 80, 90 years ago when the scientific structure and requirements and papers which just hadn't been refined to the point that it is today. So I can't repeat and go back and do this again because there's information that was left out. Nevertheless, and again, the reason I'm showing this is because Dr. Powell had good reasons to do the work he did. But between 1939 and 1967, when he published those papers, there was a lot of ambiguity as to what's going on. People were following certain procedures and methods. And then Dr. Powell came along and said, well, I'm finding that none of those really happened in my case, being disease or winter kill as a result of late season nitrogen application. I didn't see any of that. And then after Powell's papers, when a lot of the management practices begin to change and go, well, you know what, we can apply nitrogen in the fall and everything's okay. But before Powell's papers, there was this, and this is what they were going on, and that is, well, get into it. This paper did find some damage. The condition under which turf-forming grasses on lawns and recreation fields are maintained are highly exacting. This is due chiefly to frequent and often close defoliation. On golf courses and athletic fields, the situation is further aggravated by much trampling. So today we'd say traffic. Remember, this is 1939. To maintain a good sward under such adverse conditions, resort is often made to liberal use of fertilizers in order to take full advantage of cool growing weather in late autumn and early spring. The top dresses are often made in the fall. So he's saying, hey, during the cool weather season in the fall, nitrogen application is sometimes made. Real simple. These applications are regarded as desirable where annual weeds such as crabgrass are a pest. Under such conditions, spring and summer treatments may do more harm than good through undue stimulation of the weeds. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is back pre-pesticides that we use today. They didn't have the herbicide, pre-emergent herbicides and post-emergent herbicides that we have today. So back then, weed presence and weed populations were a huge issue. And so they were saying you should really should avoid these certain times of year to apply nitrogen because it's going to enhance the growth in the population of weeds. That was a major issue back in the 30s and 40s. In the judgment of many practical turf growers, however, late fall applications are detrimental because, in their opinion, they interfere with the normal hardening off of the grass with the coming of cold weather and thus render it less resistant to the low temperature of winter. So they're saying, very simple, the thought process was a lot of nitrogen in the fall is going to increase the risk of cold damage or winter kill. And so the objective of this paper was to determine whether or not the above assumptions held by certain growers has any basis in fact. Even though this is in 39, and this wouldn't probably be allowed today, I love the way that's written. I don't know why. You probably couldn't get that in today's papers the way it's written, but it says, do we want to know whether or not the assumptions that these people have, or is there any fact, to support them at all? I love the way it's written. The investigation was comprised of two parts. Certain physiochemical determinations were made of unfertilized and heavily fertilized turfgrass, determinations of constituents which are generally regarded as associated with winter hardness. I'm not going to show those. It has to do with moisture and sap and things like that. Number two, the two classes of grass were exposed to varying degrees of artificial refrigeration and thus was determined under comparable conditions the resistance of each to low temperature. I'm going to show that. So they're going to show like nitrogen applications control and high nitrogen applications, and then I'm going to show part of the paper that says there was either survival or a reduction in survival following the exposure to cold temperature. Okay, I don't know where this was done. This was in the 30s. They didn't do things the way they do it today, but I don't know where they conducted this. They don't show it in the materials and methods. But they used Kentucky bluegrass. Although each received its nitrogen through a different carrier, all were top dressed to receive nitrogen at the same rate of 2.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And they made the applications in April, June, September in 1931, and then April, July, and October in the next year, 1932, I guess. Okay. Oh no, 1930, 1931. Okay. So you have to imagine back then people were on food lines from the Great Depression in 1929 when the stock market crashed, and it was just it was just destitute poverty in many parts of the United States. And here these guys are out doing research on nitrogen applications to turfgrass. So it's set the stage. It's very, very interesting what they were doing back then. Okay. There was an unfertilized check supplement. Okay. I'm not going to go through that. Now, to test the relative resistance of unfertilized and fertilized Kentucky bluegrass to low temperatures, a quantity of each kind was grown in gallon jars in a greenhouse in the winter of 1932 and 33. The grass was grown in jars so they could be transferred without disturbance of the roots to an artificial refrigeration room, and they're exposed. So that's how they did it. They grew it in a greenhouse. They transferred it into a cold chamber, is what we call today, or a controlled temperature chamber, and they exposed it to temperature at various temperatures for various lengths of time, and then they removed them, and then they watched them grow for another 2 weeks, and whatever pots were dead, they marked as not survived. Real simple. And any pots that survived, they marked them as survived. And that's how you're going to see the data. I've whited out all this stuff in here. It's a lot of information if you want it. Again, this paper was published in Plant Physiology. It's a journal. You can actually go download this. It's actually available for free. Just Google the title, Effect of Heavy and Late Application of Nitrogenous Fertilizers on the Cold Resistance of Kentucky Bluegrass. and it'll pop up one of the first 2 or 3 links, and you can download this for free. It's in Plant Physiology Journal, 1939. Okay. So the results of freeze Kentucky bluegrass grown in a greenhouse. and then he did another study, I'm going to show it in a second, where he had them growing outside, and he collected the samples at different months. The idea being that if I collected in October versus November, the November collection might have a different physiological stage whereby the turf may have hardened off, and the turf might be acclimating itself to the cold weather because it stayed out longer. And then if you did it in December, maybe the December plants acclimated even more, and maybe they hardened off. So he collected some in October, he collected some in November, and he collected some in December. And then he froze them. And I'm going to show that after this table. So we're looking at the effect of just temperature, but we're also looking at the effect of temperature following a hardening off effect, a hardening off time period at low and high nitrogen. Okay. So this is the first one without the hardening off effect. Okay. It is evident from the high nitrogen. It is evident that the high nitrogen was more than, so this, remember, this is 2.5 pounds of nitrogen from ammonium sulfate, 3 applications. So 7.5 pounds of nitrogen. And this low end from my best, it didn't identify low and high end. But from my best understanding of the paper, is the low end is the non-treated plots, the no nitrogen. I could be wrong on that, but I've read this paper 2 or 3 times, and I can't see where they applied a low and a high. They applied 7.5 pounds of nitrogen or no nitrogen. So it is evident that the high nitrogen was more susceptible than low nitrogen grass to low temperature, since at each sub-zero temperature, the percentage of survival was lower. So when you see here, here it is. The low is at 95 when exposed to when the soil temperature was -6. The high nitrogen was 50. So we're talking about a 50% reduction in survival when high nitrogen was applied. Okay. And as the temperature declines from 6 down to 16 here, okay, the temperature is going down. You can see that both survival of the low and high do go down, but the high nitrogen, say at 11, is at 45%, and at the low nitrogen is at 80%. So you can see that the high nitrogen here is resulting in a reduction in survival. Okay. That's just by simple exposure to cold temperatures. All right. So there's a little bit of information here that might convince you that this is, high nitrogen is causing damage to turf. Let's get to this graph. This is kind of let's see if I can get it all on the screen here. This is the one where we're talking about hardening off. So what I've done here in these green boxes is I've highlighted the low and high nitrogen survival. And you look up here and you'll see October, he collected them in October 20th. He collected this one October 12th, October 16th, and December 1st. So he's collecting the samples outside at these different dates, and then putting the samples in a freeze chamber, freezing them, and then taking them out and seeing how many of them survived after 2 weeks. So he took them out and then watched them grow for 2 weeks. So he exposed them to -25 degrees Celsius. And here's the times. He exposed it for 2 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, or 5.25 hours. Okay, so he took them out of the field, put them in a freeze chamber basically for 2.5 hours, or 4 or 5 or 5.25 hours at -25 degrees C. All right, and you can see here the final soil temperature that he ended up going to. Now you can see in both of these at the October 20th sampling date were the same. 100% survived for 2.5 hours, 50% survived at 4 hours, but at 5 hours subjected to -25, all the turf was dead, whether it was at low or at high. Then in November, so 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, he collected them again, and you'll start to see a little bit of separation where all of them survived at 2.25 hours. 100% of the low nitrogen survived at 4.5, but only 75% of the high nitrogen. You can start to see now at 5 hours, 75% of the low nitrogen pots are still alive, but almost all the high nitrogen pots are dead. Okay. When it was collected on November 12th. So now November 16th, we see kind of similar results. But let's skip ahead to December 1st. So now the December 1st turf has been outside for a much longer period than October, another couple of months. The idea being that the turf got the chance to harden off a little bit more, and that the influence of freezing would be a little bit less, or it would be a little more hardy, I guess is the way to say it. The turf would be more resistant to cold temperature. And you can start to see that is true. So we see that when the plants were subjected to cold temperatures for 2 and 3/4 hours, the low nitrogen 100% survived. 3 hours, 100% survived at low nitrogen. But even at 5 hours, we still had 40% survival of the low from the low nitrogen treatment. Okay. Whereas at 5 hours, when the sample was collected in October, we had 0 survival at no nitrogen. So that kind of gives you an idea, is that if to allow the plant to harden off is beneficial in terms of its ability to resist cold tolerance. Okay. However, when we applied high nitrogen, so this was a very low nitrogen, a high nitrogen, you can see an effect. Only 75% is survived at as exposed to 2.5 hours of cold temperatures. So the idea being that at night, maybe the temperature drops by whatever temperature, and it's exposed to freezing temperatures for 2 3/4 hours. 75% survived, 25% died when it was exposed to high nitrogen, and none of it died when it was exposed to low nitrogen. And you can see the survival rate declines greatly as the temperature as the exposure is prolonged for more time. And the difference between these two is the effect of the nitrogen rate. So this is where Dr. Powell, and others at the time received information from. This is what they were saying when they said, I'm going to go through the rest of the paper in a second. But this is what they were saying when they said, hey, people are not applying nitrogen in the fall, because the idea is that applying nitrogen in the fall is going to result in some harm to the turf. And there was some evidence to support that. It wasn't just crazy talk. I mean, it wasn't just people doing whatever they want to do. There was some research, albeit not, typically or standard for according to today's standards, it's not strong, but there was something there in the literature for their standards back then that was sufficiently convincing to have turfgrass managers avoid applying nitrogen in the fall, because clearly there were some issues in terms of its ability to resist cold damage, cold tolerance. Okay, let's go back to the PDF. So the discussion on this, and this is almost done. We only have just a few pages, actually, not even a couple paragraphs. So artificial refrigeration of Kentucky bluegrass grown in greenhouses and hardened in the low temperature chamber showed that high was more susceptible than low nitrogen grasses to sub-zero temperatures. Likewise, artificial refrigeration of Kentucky bluegrass grown out of doors and hardened naturally by gradually lowering temperatures during the fall months showed that high was more susceptible than low nitrogen grass to sub-zero. So in this case, in Kentucky bluegrass, I don't know where this was conducted. They didn't tell me where it was conducted, but in this case, they're showing that high nitrogen did result in increased damage when exposed to cold tolerance. The refrigeration test therefore indicates that heavy and late applications of nitrogen fertilizer Kentucky bluegrass reduce its resistance to sub-zero temperatures. So you can see very clearly why they thought that back then, why they were not applying nitrogen back then before Powell's paper, because there wasn't a whole lot of work, but there was some work done, and then clearly it showed that there were some potential problems. The results indicate that applications of nitrogenous fertilizers in the fall, when the grass is naturally hardening off, reduce the elaboration of hydrophilic colloids. I don't know what they're referring to here in the hydrophilic colloids in the plant, but that's just what they thought. The expressible sap duration or during that period is consistently higher in the high than in the low nitrogen, on contrary to bound water. I didn't show this. He talks about bound water and hydrophilic colloids and basically constituents inside the plant that were associated, they're thought to be associated with cold tolerance. Let's go down to the summary. I'll just talk about the last two summary points here. This would be the conclusions. You can read the conclusions here, but I just highlighted the last two. Artificial refrigeration of both classes of grass after hardening showed that the high nitrogen grass was less resistant than low nitrogen grass to low temperatures. The last one is, inasmuch as the difference in nitrogen content of the Kentucky bluegrass was induced by heavy and late applications of nitrogenous fertilizers, it follows that such a practice may be expected to lessen somewhat the resistance of Kentucky bluegrass to low temperatures. So now it might make sense why Dr. Powell was doing that. why was he actually going in and measuring these things? Because there was, from 30 years before he did it, no one was really applying nitrogen in the fall. And for some reason, he's like, well, it seems like that'd be a good time to apply it. That's when the grass is growing. But people aren't doing it because they think the grass is going to die. So he went out and in his studies, he showed that in the field, he didn't have any death. There was no disease that came up. There was no, adverse consequence to applying the nitrogen. Now, don't do this, but even when he was applying 2 pounds a month for a total of 10 pounds of nitrogen in the fall in Virginia, he didn't see those same problems. Okay. And since then, there's been a number of people continuing to do work. Occasionally, they'll show some issues in terms of risk and turf damage risk. Occasionally, they'll show issues. Occasionally, they'll show some adverse consequences that are not associated with the turf, which is what we'll kind of go into in a future video. But in terms of the harm to the turf itself, Dr. Powell didn't find any. There really wasn't a lot of evidence to support, not applying nitrogen because you think it's going to harm your turf. It didn't in the fall and for cool season grasses. It just didn't seem to, there wasn't much evidence to support that notion. But the reason why he did it was because of this. There was some evidence prior to him that showed Kentucky bluegrass might have a problem. Okay. So those are the two little articles I did today. Tomorrow's podcast will be at night. So I'm probably going to start doing Wednesdays at night to kind of give people an opportunity who aren't available at this time to participate or to join during the live stream. So I'll do it tomorrow at 9 p.m. That might be a regular thing from now on. So Wednesday's podcast will be at 9 p.m. And then so it'll be Monday, Tuesday, Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern time. And then Wednesday it'll be at 9 p.m. I'm going to end up making some adjustments to the podcast at some point. But I think the Wednesday at 9 p.m. might be a standard thing. We'll see how that goes. And tomorrow's paper is going to be, I already have that here. It's going to be, I'm kind of going, starting late in the 30s and the 60s with the early papers, and I'm moving more to today's papers. So tomorrow's paper will be the Wilkinson paper, and the Wilkinson 72 paper, and then I'm going to go to 73, 74, and then I'm going to skip to the 2000s. So I'm doing some of the early papers. So the Wilkinson paper that I'll be covering tomorrow night is a bit more in depth, but it's titled "The Effects of Fall Fertilization on Cold Resistance, Color, and Growth of a Kentucky Bluegrass." So this is very similar to the Carrol 39 paper I just discussed. He's talking about the cold resistance of Kentucky bluegrass is affected by fall fertilization, but he's including color and growth in this as well. So we'll see what happened between 1939 when some of the early papers came out, or the early paper came out, between then and 1972 when they're doing something very similar on the same grass. So that'll be tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Okay. Thank you all for showing up today. Thank you for participating in chat. If you can join me tomorrow night at 9 p.m., do so. I'll be back on regular time on Thursday at 10 a.m. Don't forget, Monday, we have a guest author on Monday, and that show will be at 11 a.m. Eastern time. You probably want to be here for that one. The last guest author that came on, it seemed like people liked that. So we'll hear it in his own words what he did and what the importance of his paper was. Okay. Appreciate everybody for showing up. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.